Good morning, watchers. Welcome to Brother Sal's Sunday Gathering at the Storehouse, our weekly commentary on world events. We first started in 1996 and have become more relevant ever since. Today, posting 2 shows per week to our YouTube channels, BroSal and Philadelphia Church. For 20 years, we have integrated the historical landscape that unfolds daily with the prophetic analysis anticipated by eschatology. We bring you non-traditional insights and uncensored discussion of issues purposely ignored by media of all kinds. Join us now for the only discussion of its kind. And joining me again this week is my son, Tony. Welcome, Tony. What do you have for us?
Good morning, Dad. Thanks for having me on the show. I've been, as some may know from last week's Bible study, I'm just back from, well, I'm not really back yet on the internet. I've been almost 3 weeks now without internet. And so that's put a little bit of a crimp into my study schedule. I haven't been able to spend the hours surfing the net and finding the dirt on the pulling the strings stuff that we've been studying. So I've spent this morning downloading some news articles from this last week so that I can try and catch up a little bit on the news that we're watching. And I just listened to the latest from Sheikh Imran Hussein from a couple of weeks ago in an interview where he was discussing what's going on in the world right now. So I have a few things that have influenced me from his discussion. And I suppose the most important of which is that, well, there's a few things that he brought up that I think are really pertinent to what we've been watching and the eschatological view. And one is his expectation of the demise of the current monetary system in favor of a digital one for the world. He sees as being prefigured in the way that the English pound had to be essentially destroyed or devalued to make way for the new American dollar, and the passing of the torch, as it were, from the England being the ruling state in the world to America being the ruling state in the world. And that what's coming in Sheikh Hussein's view, according to eschatology, is that Israel is destined to be the next ruling state in the world. That's where the geopolitics is really leading, and the Zionists behind the scenes. That's where they're pushing everything. And because of that, the American dollar, and along with it, the euro, must also vanish to make way for this new universal digital currency. And that, along with the war, will provide for this transition to the next ruling state, being Israel, and coming out of Jerusalem. And not only that, that because what they declare is that the Holy Land is to extend from the River Nile to the River Euphrates, that's essentially all of the Middle East, all the most valuable part of Palestine, the East Delta of Egypt, which is the breadbasket of Egypt, the oil fields of Iraq, and all the natural resources of that region. And so from Sheikh Hussein's perspective, this is the play that's coming. This is what is working behind the scenes from the Zionist agenda, is to create a world in which they rule the world from that territory, centered out of Jerusalem, new international currency, which leads, of course, to a new international government, which leads to sort of I don't think it'll be a religion. I think it'll be the absence of religion, in the same way France denies any organized religion any kind of substantial place in its society. That's the whole point of the Enlightenment. Get rid of all these superstitions, get the church out of our lives, get the kings, these ones that think they have a divine right to rule, get them out of our lives and let the people all be equal. That was the whole idea of the Enlightenment. And France, being the centerpiece politically of that time, set their government up specifically along those lines. Funny how France, being the origin of the old world and the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, has become the center of the new ideology of no religion having any prominence, religion being something that's personal and private. And so I see the New World Order as a place where there isn't an official religion. What's official is that there is no religion. Religion is a private matter, like ornamentation, like drinking, or what clothes you wear, or what makeup, what hat you wear. That's all religion will amount to in the New World. And anyone who tries to give it any more significance than that will be, either figuratively or literally martyred, because they're not going to let the world go down that path again. So I think that's the story from that angle. But when you look at the longevity of the transition from the English pound to the American dollar, and then this couple of 100 years, actually much less, 100 years since the formation of the Federal Reserve and essentially the takeover of the world by the dollar, you start to see the time that these visions, they take time in history to come about, and the people who are putting their money and effort behind them aren't expecting instant results, right? The Cecil Rhodes of the world, he went down there to take over all those diamond mines for England, put the South Africans under absolute oppression, steal their wealth for the English Empire, and put it into wills that this money should always go toward funding these secret societies to carry out the conquest of the world for God and country. Now, there's a lot of evidence that America is simply the next transition. England didn't lose anything. They just sort of moved the headquarters, right? They built the military in America. They moved to this huge, new, free land where they could do anything they wanted. And now they had to fight with those like Thomas Jefferson, who wanted to establish a government outside of the normal channels of rulership. But it's pretty clear from what I've studied, Dad, that Jefferson and those folks lost that battle. Right? They were hauled into Revolutionary War, Civil War, and finally a government system that's been purged of all possible, libertarian ideals, except in, lip service. But nobody stands for the fact that the average worker is the one that's important, that the average American is the one that has to be looked out for. I mean, come on, none of the things we've done over the last 100 years have been done in that light at all. The industrialism, the Federal Reserve, the takeover of the banks, compulsory education, none of these things were aimed at elevating the average man. I don't care what the lip service story has been. The proof is in what's really gone on. And what's really gone on over all this time is that the money has stayed in the same hands. The rulership has stayed in the same hands. I mean, is it coincidence that almost all of the rulers of this new country of America, this great and free liberal country cut off from the royalty of England, all happen to be somehow related to the royal bloodlines? I mean, is that even, wouldn't you think that those were the people you would exclude from possible leadership? No, but instead, that's who all our modern leaders are, as if there's been a takeover that's been going on all along. They took it from Jefferson and the guys that wanted real liberty. They got it back into the same bankers' hands. I mean, the Federal Reserve comes out of the Bank of England. I mean, are these different people? And so I'm trying to make the argument that, it all goes back to these same Khazarian Jews that wound up being the bankers, that wound up taking over the Bank of England and literally the country of England, the whole territory of Europe. So it's really the same people transferring their power the way a corporation moves its headquarters. You start out in a headquarters that are appropriate based on geography and size. But as you achieve your goals, you move on to the next headquarters, which might be not only a larger building, but in a different location. And so I think that if you look at history in the last 100 years or so, as something along those lines, that this transfer to as Sheikh Hussein calls it, Pax Judaica, the next ruling state in the world, it's the same people. Nobody's losing and gaining anything. It's just a change of address and a change of building. But the people who occupy the building still descend from the same people. And now when you, stand back and look at history that way, and then you think, okay, Russia, the revolution, all created by these same Jews, all funded by the same Khazarian Jewish money. The Holocaust, same Khazarian Jewish money. The Ukrainian Holocaust of all the Christians in Russia, same Khazarian Jewish money. The establishment of America, the establishment of Palestine. And now I'm starting to see the connection, for instance, why Russia? I've been saying all along how it doesn't make any sense. You can't make any sense of the narrative the way it's given to us, of Russia just building up these arms in the face of everybody. And now here we are again in a worse condition than the Cold War. And we're supposed to believe that all these intelligent people, all of these historians, all of these philosophers, all of these rational and reasonable men, just nothing they could do, right? Even after all the wars. And I've been reading a book, Dad, this past couple of weeks called Voltaire's Bastards by John Ralston Saul. And it's a big, laborious, long-winded book of over 600 pages. It says it's a controversial bestseller, international bestseller, and it makes sense because it doesn't touch the reality at all. It seems to be a genuinely confused person writing from a somewhat innocent perspective that just happens to ignore the power behind all the realities that he brings to our attention. He's happy to show us all the figures of even the 18th and especially the 19th and 20th centuries, the Napoleons and the Churchills and all the way down through our modern, up to his time when this was written in the 90s, all the way through all the way through Reagan and those people up through our modern day. And yet, all of his argument is based on these good people being led in the wrong direction through the adherence to reason and rationale that was, being first really fostered by Voltaire and this Enlightenment movement in Europe, where they were trying to wrest the power from these monarchs and this church and put it in the hands of average human beings. And so this author's argument is that the descendants down through time of Voltaire and of reason have been crippled by their own philosophy into creating the structures that, among other things, drag us into endless wars, create an international arms trade where none existed before, the degradation of societies, of environments, of everything that we see today, where somehow no matter all these good intentions, what's actually happened is all the resources, all the money, all the real power in the world keeps funneling ever more consistently and even exponentially into the hands of the same very few. While those same very few who own everything and have all the power and manipulate all the governments see fit to keep building arms and sending children, normally not their own, off into these brutal wars. So one of the things I've enjoyed about this book, Voltaire's Bastards, is the historical perspective, because of course a lot of the history is accurate. The wars, the amount of people, the amount of armaments, who sold what to who attacked who, and all those things. That's all a matter, most of it, a matter of history. It's the reasoning that I absolutely, find in his book to be almost absurd and hard to keep reading. He's continually pointing out the mindlessness of these decisions, the impracticality, the destruction wrought by these decisions, but never once does he say, who funds these? Who brought Churchill to power? Who brought Stalin to power? Who maintained that power? Who built these weapons? Who installed these industrial systems? Who argued for these continual deregulations that result in the populace of every country, not just ours, becoming poorer while the elite classes become richer and more ingrained. And for this John Ralston Saul, it's all just an accidental manner of, believing in the Enlightenment, believing in reason and rationale and putting those as banner heads to follow. And by following those, we've just, innocently, good men that head up these countries, that head up these world banks, that head up these arms industries, that head up these militaries, good, innocent men that simply are following reason down this path of destruction. And nobody seems, and constantly this author is questioning the absurdity of their decision-making and the lack of historical reference. Why not look back and see that doing it that way didn't work 100 years ago, it didn't work 50 years ago, so why are you even increasing those leverage points today? Again, he's going to write that off as simply an adherence to a rational perspective, where I find that an absurdly myopic and even, purposely blinded ideal. When you have in front of you the evidence of he never mentions Carroll Quigley in this book so far. Not one time has the idea that there is a cartel behind these mouthpieces of politics and public service, and that they feed a train of events through their funding and that they're aware of the historical reality, and therefore the decisions that are being made are ones that are purposeful. They're not some accidental innocence, but a purposeful manipulation into the world that we have today. And I'm constantly trying to draw that on the line of understanding that how can we imagine that these good-intentioned people with all the power and influence in the world, who set about to disarm the world and make it a peaceful and fair place to live, have managed to arm the world and make it an endless war and a place where the segregation and the disparagement between the haves and have-nots, grows ever, exponential. And that doesn't seem to ever get changed no matter who's in power, no matter what reforms are applied. It actually, the reforms, as this person points out, often make matters worse. Like Barack Obama is the latest one. Hope and change. The whole world was so ready to get away from George Bush and see Barack Obama as the reformer that was going to bring at least some sort of, a step in the positive direction. And yet, the history books are quickly filling up with people pointing out that it's become even a more dark government of secrets, of militaristic dominance, of imperialism, of, lies and backhanded group politics, right? They're all in on it. They're all just playing their part, red team, blue team. And so under Obama, if anything, the reformists, the great reformists the whole world thought was going to bring about hope and change, things have gotten actually worse, if that's even possible to imagine. But, again, the statistics seem to point at that. And so one of those things I found this week in looking at it is the way Russia's involved. As I say, I don't see Russia as the great enemy, except that they've been set up in the way the politics of America, the Republicans, are set up as the enemy of the Democrats. None of them are true enemies, because when it comes down to it, they all do exactly what needs to be done, voting for compulsory education, wars, stripping of the civil rights of the people of the country. When it comes to those things, it doesn't seem to matter who's in power. That momentum of, not progress, but regress, progress that is actually damaging, that momentum continues. And it doesn't matter who's in power, and never has. They make a show on the surface of arguing against the other guy's policies, and we're going to reverse this. But what did Obama do? He came in with this grand idea of Obamacare, because he's going to make that the centerpiece of his presidency, remember? And what's Obamacare become? Nothing but a big joke, nothing but a very expensive slap in the face of reform, a reform that costs more in every way. Let's just talk about the time that it took, the time out of everyone's lives when we needed to talk about serious issues of reform. And instead, what was this? All just a play. Meanwhile, have the pharmaceutical companies lost money during Obama's term? Nope, they're richer than ever. Do the banks and pharmaceutical companies and lobbyists have less power now thanks to Obama's reforms? Nope, they have more power. So, on every issue. So I'm just trying to set that stage that when I tell you that, Russia is being set up as the enemy, China is being set up as the enemy. And so look at evidences like this. Russia sends guns now to Egypt, right? Egypt has to buy their guns from Russia. Why? Well, Egypt is participating with Saudi Arabia to fight Yemen, which is a proxy war against Iran. And I think Sheikh Hussein's perspective is correct on this, and he's been saying it for a long time. He's been saying that the reason they got rid of the Shah of Iran and made him out to be such a terrorist, and maybe he was, all of these leaders are terrorists because there is no such thing as a man of the people. They don't make it. They get taken out by these terrorists. And if there is a man of the people, if there is a democratically elected government, like there was in Chile, like there was in Bolivia, like there was in Nicaragua, like there was in Argentina, anywhere. If there ever is, you can bet we will sell drugs and guns to fund terrorists to change that government to be one that goes along with our terrorism in the world, as we did in Nicaragua in the 80s. And as we're doing with ISIS today. And so what the Sheikh points out is that they needed that Iranian revolution to set up a strongman Shia regime so that they could eventually have Shia-Sunni civil war. That as long as there was a Sunni regime, or as long as there was any leader that was an inclusionist that was trying to bring the Islam together, bring the sects together into solidarity, that there could never be this Sunni-Shia civil war. And if you look back, this was at the time that Brzezinski was pointing out, you can't let these people come together over there. You got this whole Eurasia is the future. This is where the resources come from, both physical and human. And so you got to control that territory or lose your ability, perhaps, in the future to control it. So when you look at the manipulations that were going on for 100 years, and then you go back to the CIA and the way they were manipulating South America, the way they were manipulating Iran already, the way they were manipulating China through General Mao and the revolution there, setting everything up so that you could have, the way I see it, a game board in the end. Remember, I'm still looking at this as somebody wants war, not somebody. The people that have all the power want war, because otherwise, if they didn't, it wouldn't make sense to send your guns to all of your enemies, to build weapons and sell them in the market like candy to the highest bidder, no matter who it was. Because now what happens when those weapons, even if they get sold to your friends, let's say Saudi Arabia, well, what happens if Iran takes over Saudi Arabia? All those weapons are now in Iran's hands, aren't they? And so that's why something that Ralston Saul points out in this book is how this whole arms race came into being and how well known it was through the 19th century anyway and into the 20th that, you can't give your arms to anyone but your own army. Otherwise, you're potentially shooting yourself in the foot. How can you guarantee that those arms won't be turned on you someday? Whereas if you're creating the most sophisticated arms and keeping them in your own army, well, you're ensuring your own security, aren't you? So this is not a new idea, you guys, and the people that are running the world are quite aware of all of these ideas. These are the people who read these books and publish these books. These are the people who published Machiavelli and know exactly what the Prince is all about and have been following those prototypes as they've applied through the centuries. And so these people are quite aware of the idea that you don't sell your guns just on the market to anybody, especially your high-tech weaponry. What about when they use it against you? And so if there ever had been a desire not to have another great war, well, then the decision would have been made at the time not to distribute weapons throughout the entire world. And yet that's exactly what they did. Distribute weapons, like I keep pointing out, Philippines, Yemen, Taiwan, the poorest countries in the world are just in debt up to their great-grandchildren's eyeballs. And that's not even true. They're in debt forever. They're in unending, perpetual debt so that they can be fully armed to the teeth and their children can go be used as bodies. And again, this book I'm reading, he points out the history of that, how these, military strategy in the last 100 years has nothing to do with what it was in the ancient times when it was really about finding ways to use the fewest lives and take the most. The modern world is really about simple throwing machinery and bodies into it. Just keep throwing bodies at it, even though there's a dozen strategies more humane, with less destruction on both physical and human. I thought this book did a nice job to demonstrate that instead of following any of the potential strategies for a less destructive, less murderous wars, that we've actually done the opposite. We've actually done the opposite. If you look at the history of it, the strategy has been to throw more murder into it, more bodies and more destruction. And so, again, doesn't that play into the hands of the people that don't want the population? I mean, they don't want a huge population. They don't see anything in the masses except danger to themselves. Well, that makes sense then. If you're going to have a war, well, let's just kill off as much of the masses on both sides, on every side, as we can. And so I say this is your perspective, guys, if you want to see what's going on in the world, that this is what is really going on. The buildup of arms toward mass murder, mass destruction that's coming in the future. And all of that toward this long-term design, right? This new world order where the American empire served its purpose. The dollar and the enslavement of the world. Remember, that all happened through banking, you guys. It all happened through fractional reserve banking and the loaning of money to countries to fight wars of overwhelming aggression and needless waste, right? I mean, start to see the connection here. You don't just sell a country on a good strategy for getting ahead. You sell a country on borrowing more money than it can ever repay to buy more arms than it can ever use to go kill more people than are necessary. And you do that with everybody as just a business plan. Now, what kind of world could you be imagining with that sort of program? If it's not one in which you divide and conquer, divide and conquer, divide and conquer until the world is destroyed enough that it's manageable. So it's within that context that I see everything that's going on today and why you have something like, Russia, whose allies are, say, Iran and Syria, because in this game board, if they weren't, there would be too much NATO power the other way. There'd be too much Western influence the other way, and there wouldn't have to be a big war, right? If Iran was all, in on NATO, where's the division come? The division in populace, the division that can bring about huge battles of people to hate each other. How do you do that? If you get everybody sort of allied with one another, doing business with one another, living together. I mean, remember, the Jews have been living side by side with the Muslims for 1,000 years before we interfered, or at least, maybe not 1,000 years, but yeah, over 1,000 years. And then all of a sudden now you've got all this hatred. And what's really crazy is even though the Zionists have come into Palestine, terrorized their neighbors, terrorized the Arabs, what you have today is the Sunnis and Shias hate each other more than they hate the Zionists, right? So, I see an ultimate strategy in that. I see that somebody's strategizing. Again, when you look at the influence, we've been putting money into Iran and our hands and our political intrigue since the 50s. England has been in that part of the world for 100 years. NATO just took over Libya so that they could become a nation of terrorists. And Imran Hossein's position is because that way, when it comes time to attack Egypt, which he points out the Zionists need that eastern delta of Egypt as part of their territory when they become the ruling state in the world. So they are going to attack Egypt, is the perspective that he points out. Well, that way, Libya can attack from one side and Israel from the other. And so while Russia's trying to maintain Iran as an ally in Syria, why in the world would they be sending weapons to Egypt to fight a proxy war against Iran? Why would you do that? Because if Egypt and Saudi Arabia are able to defeat Iran, doesn't that undermine a much more strategic part of Russia's puzzle than selling a few arms and making a couple of dollars? See, but if the arms salesmen are all the same people, whether they're Russian arms, Israeli arms, French arms, American arms, if none of that really matters, and all that really matters is the balance of a game board in which you're trying to create an eventual conflict so big that there's parity in both armaments and human combatants, well, then that kind of makes sense for Russia to do, right? Send some arms to Egypt. NATO's sending the arms to, everybody around them. Saudi Arabia. And so I think one of the things we need to watch for, that Sheikh Hussein is correct about, is that we appear to be trying to provoke Iran into crossing the border and attacking somewhere in the Saudi peninsula, like Bahrain. And that in Sheikh Hussein's opinion, if that were to happen, that would bring about Shia-Sunni civil war. My question is still the timing of all these elements. Is Shia-Sunni civil war the next thing we're watching for? Is the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem the next thing we're watching for? Is the rise of the unsealing of Revelation and this righteous ruler that's given a crown of honor, is that the next thing that we're watching for? Is nuclear war the next thing that we're watching for? Is the redrawing of the lines of the Middle East the next thing we're watching for? Because all these things are on the horizon. As well as the Great War, which I don't think is the next thing we're watching for. I really believe that this Great War must still be many years in the future. That's why Jesus told the apostles, nation will rise against nation, wars and rumors of wars, but don't be alarmed at this, right? This is just the beginning of sorrows. So see, this is all the beginning. Now, when you look at how long it's taken, 100 years since they reestablished Palestine and redrew those lines that created Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Israel. I mean, it's 100 years to now. Now we're at the beginning of sorrows in the way the excuse me, the way Jesus seems to record it, or the way it's recorded of him expressing it to the apostles. And so, I say the real search for me right now, Dad, in all of this geopolitical stuff is, what are we really expecting next? I think you have to realize that the fear-mongering never, ever stops. 20 years ago, same thing was going on. When I read this book, same sort of ideas. Russia was building up arms again. And, all of the talk about, the doomsday scenarios, those don't change, and the reason is because that's what keeps people in fear. It not only keeps selling the newspapers, which is secondary to the idea that it keeps people in fear. And fear is what allows criminals, a handful of criminals, to enslave hundreds of millions of people. Because we're always in fear. We're in fear of the next boogeyman. We're in fear of the next terrorist. We're in fear of the next catastrophe. We're in fear of the next plague. We're in fear of the next ice age or thermal flare, or it just doesn't matter. We're in fear. Aliens are going to attack us. AIDS is going to kill us. It just doesn't matter as long as we're always in fear. No one bothers to argue through this same fear-mongering journalism that in fact, terrorism doesn't kill as many people as, improperly handled food. Terrorism doesn't kill as many people as slipping on the soap in the shower. And yet, rather than reform our food policies, right, or build our showers with non-skid floors in them, we seek to undermine the entire, I don't know how to say it, I would say function, but it's a dysfunction, to undermine the entire dysfunction of the world to create more fear, more terror, and more dysfunction, destruction. And so none of that makes any sense unless it's on purpose. This is what I have to keep coming back to, and I appreciate that there's a few of you that are getting it, because I tell you, most of the world is not getting it. And there's a reason for that, you guys. They spending billions for 50 years now to brainwash everybody through your televisions, your radios, and your internet. There's a reason you can't stand to hear that there were no airplanes on 9/11, that Islamic terrorists, fundamentalists did not attack America. Oh, that just absolutely galls Americans. They cannot stand to hear that, and yet there's not a shred of evidence except in the other direction. There's a mountain of evidence that there were no, you can't even call it evidence. It's perfectly clear by existence itself. The fact of existence itself undermines any sort of argument that airplanes flew into buildings, the same way existence itself undermined the argument that Oswald, with his old bolt-action rifle, fired all those bullets at the President Kennedy's motorcade. All right? Obvious cartoon. And yet, because of the propaganda at the time, hey, man, they ruined people's lives, right? They tried to ruin Garrison's life. The only guy that was, respectable, a man of respect, trying to simply ask the right questions and get to the bottom of it. And instead of, the average American praising that and getting behind that and joining that, adding solidarity to that movement, they were offended. And so, if you can't get your mind around your own brainwashing, well, you got a lot tougher road to go. If you don't think the brainwashing's been working on you and me too, of course it has. That's why we resist so much of the obvious now that it's becoming more and more obvious. Like the fact that whatever's going on in the world, it's going on purpose, not on accident. It's not a bunch of good people accidentally trying their best and yet destroying the world on every front. Destroying human life, destroying the infrastructure, destroying the physical planet, destroying every semblance of freedom and liberty. You're right, destroying every good thing that was created. And then if you pull in a deep eschatological view that reaches back for an explanation that's spiritual, that sees some sort of divine hand in this, meaning this Antichrist, this, why wouldn't you want to destroy everything that was good? Why would you want anybody to think that the things that God had created were good? Especially when you're trying to show them that everything from the past that comes, all this belief in God and God's creation is all bad. It's all evil. And only being set free from that is the good thing. And so I think along those lines, it's not hard to see why there's a spiritual element that wants absolute destruction. Even if the human elements involved see some sort of advantageous destruction, right? They're sold on all their lies. The American military, for the most part, thinks it's fighting an enemy and can win something. And I'm sure the Russian military feels the same. I imagine the Syrians out there dying and fighting, imagine they're fighting for their nationality. And I imagine the Yemenis are fighting for what they believe in. People are fighting for what they believe in. It's just that what we've been made to believe in is manipulated. We've become brainwashed. And that's happened because first all our systems were enslaved to this money system. So that the good people, the Thomas Jeffersons of the world, which existed all over the world, how many have we had to kill? Those people had to be weeded out. And so they had to be weeded out through a system that could be set up. And that system was set up through money, through fractional reserve banking, through controlling influence. If you want to get elected, you need some money. If you want to protect yourself from an aggressor nation, you need some armaments. So we're not going to tell you that we've already been to the aggressor nation and convinced them that if they'll be more aggressive, we'll give them the armaments on a long-term funding deal. They don't have to put up any money. They just have to take the arms and go use them. We're not going to tell you that. We're just going to point out to you that in fact they have accepted arms and are preparing to use them. And unless you're going to borrow the money and build more arms, you're going to be taken over by them. And I'm going to be talking to them instead of you. And so it's not hard to see how once money became the controlling factor of nations, how then the people within those structures could then be manipulated through money, enslaved as we are today. And then, of course, debt for the average citizen. Money and other means, blackmail for politicians and people of power, threats. But debt for the average citizen, same idea. Here, have it today, pay me tomorrow, don't worry. That's because we love you, because we're trying to give you a better life. Right? Has it resulted in a better life? It has if you own stock in MasterCard and Visa and Bank of America. But if you're one of the hundreds of millions of people that for the past generation, since credit has been issued in my culture, slipping further and further and further and further into debt and destitution, Seems like a scheme that backfired on everybody, huh? And this guy I'm reading, he's just going to put that down to, again, a bunch of innocent economists. They're just following what they think are the most reasonable, rational structures without paying attention to the fact that everything they're doing is both illogical to produce positive results and inconceivable to do anything but cause more destruction. That's what this author keeps pointing out, that everything they do has this obvious imperative in front of it, and yet they do it anyway. And he wants to argue that it's just because of a philosophical, an innocent philosophical misunderstanding. I say, really, that doesn't cut much mustard with the world that I see. I say that it's on purpose, and it's leading to something. So we have to just ask ourselves what it's leading to. And I think those people that are listening to me, maybe I'm going over it a little too much, but obviously it's leading to this next great war. But before that war, I believe before that war, Sheikh Imran Hussein thinks after the war is when Israel is going to establish itself as the ruling state and declare. That's when the Antichrist, the false Messiah, will declare, I am the Messiah, and seek to rule the world. And that's when the Mahdi will return and Jesus will return and defeat him. That's Sheikh Imran Hussein's vision of what the Quran instructs. Our Christian eschatology is just, for me, through Revelation as we studied it, a little bit different, a little bit harder for me to reconcile that, since the Great War seems to come right before the physical cataclysms that that shake every mountain out of its place and every island, and so we can't have that Great War and then some new world order, at least according to the way I interpret Revelation. Also in Revelation, we have this Babylon that falls, and it falls before this great war. At least that's the way it seems to me. And most anybody nowadays really identifies this Babylon system as this financial system, this monster with, that isn't just America, it's an international monster that's oppressed the entire world, right? What did Daniel say? That fourth beast shall devour the entire earth. It just happens to be based out of America right now. As Sheikh said, it used to be based out of England and was known as Pax Britannica. Then it moved its headquarters to America and is now known as Pax Americana, the great US of A. And it would appear that the plan on somebody's level, these let's call them Zionists, this plan that's been going for 100 years, is to then move this whole thing over to Jerusalem and rule the world, what we might refer to as this synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews but are not, right? This is I don't know how else to fit all the scripture into the, how to fit the eschatological view into the historical view, right? Because this book I'm reading, that doesn't make any sense. All these accidental tourists just trying their best. He doesn't mention anything about the cabal of bankers that Quigley's aware of 25 years before he writes this book. He doesn't mention anything about the rebuilding of the temple or the Zionist agenda or all the things that have become the forefront of our world about 25 years later. This book was written, I think, in 92, published in 92. So he's obviously, as much as his historical information seems accurate enough, his conclusions, I think, now have proven to be inaccurate. But where we've come appears to be validating some of the eschatological conclusions that we've been drawing, for 30 years, in this ministry. And of course, our view has been constantly evolving as we learn more, just as the prophecy says, that people would go to and fro and knowledge would increase. And so as that knowledge is increasing, we're getting to see, those of us who are really watching, that promise. And I find that's the comfort in this modern world. I don't believe we're going to be able to escape what's coming, except as the Lord of Spirits has provided for each one of us to be where we ought to be on that day or during that time. So it's not a matter of escaping it, I don't think. It's an awareness in, what could it be but what does the Scripture show? The watchman on the watchtower. What does it say? That when that day comes, if the watchman doesn't do his job and blow his horn, God's going to hold the watchman responsible for the blood that's spilled. But if the watchman blows the horn, well, then, the people are responsible. So there's a certain element here in which it would appear that God is preparing the world to be warned, or, His mercy is such that the last two witnesses are obviously going to have some sort of effect, because the whole world's going to send gifts to one another when they finally kill those two terrorists. So, but obviously that's going to have an effect, and so I think that's, what I feel is our duty and responsibility is to be a watchman, to blow that horn, to try and keep people from being drawn into these lies eyes wide shut, and give them a chance. I don't know what else there is, Dad, because as I said, nobody's really going to escape this. The escape is it's a spiritual thing. I got reflecting this last couple of weeks on the real brevity of a human life. We're not around long enough to do anything on the scale of existence. I mean, what's 100 years? It's just not long enough to do anything but make human relationships, right? 100 years is long enough to learn who somebody else is and have them learn who you are. Enough to establish a relationship that then can go on forever, perhaps. But, like Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, all the works of our hands are but temporary and destined to just vanish. They're meaningless. Life itself, from that standpoint of accomplishment, is meaningless. It's a flash through existence, which leads me to feel much more comforted by that perspective of the spiritual life being the important one to pay attention to. How does Paul put it? I consider all these, afflictions he's going through to be nothing compared to what's in store. And so, to a certain extent, the more that I learn, the more that I feel it's all for one simple point. None of it can be changed or stopped or altered. But, to help one person see the light is just like to help one person, eat, one hungry person eat a meal. Or sit down with one lonely person and share a conversation. Go visit a homeless shelter, stuff like that. It's the real work of God in the world. It's the reality of love in the world that is the saving grace of the world, I believe. And so it's brought my own perspective to one of, rather than feeling like I'm on a soapbox trying to alter anything, I'm really just a watchman on the tower reporting on the movements that I see. So that, the blood won't be on my hands, because for whatever reason I wound up on this tower. And that comes with a responsibility. And so I believe that's all we have. Your responsibility might be to share it with your neighbor or your family, or hopefully to support ministries like ours so that this word doesn't die out, to help us get the word out to more people. But this is not going to change anything. And the frustration level, I believe, in my own country and the whole activist movement, I see now as orchestrated like everything else. They're happy to have all these activists because it creates so much angst. It creates so much againstness with people. And it's againstness that fuels their world. Hate and fear, mostly fear of each other, is what the psychologists demonstrated some 50 years ago, is what made us the most manipulatable, is that we fear each other. We don't trust each other. And so the more you can ingrain that in society, the more you will have each individual divided against the other, so that there will be less and less likelihood, in fact today no possibility, of any sort of solidarity, people coming together. They just can't do it. We're brainwashed. We're brainwashed into being afraid of each other. We're brainwashed into imagining that certain things are inevitable and others are irrelevant, when quite often the opposite is the case. For instance, it's irrelevant whether Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton gets elected president. It's irrelevant. And yet I watch all the people on Facebook, boy, the pro-Trumpers and the pro-Clinton, and everybody can't wait to point at what's wrong with the other one. All that energy. And the people behind the scenes must be laughing their butt off, because it's irrelevant. Just like it was irrelevant that Obama became president instead of John McCain. Do you really think the world would have been different under John McCain? I say it would have been exactly the same, because the people with the plans aren't waiting for the next president to see if he approves of them. That can't be possible, you guys. That can't be possible. The people who are making the guns and planning who they're going to ship them to, who they're going to fight a war with, who they're going to kill tomorrow, are not waiting to see whether John McCain or Obama gets elected so we can run it by him and see if we can get their approval. And yet that's the way Americans argue it, irrelevant. And yet, such things as the coming World War, the complete degradation of society, the fall of the American Empire, the debasement of the economic system, all of that is inevitable. There's no way to stop it. No way to stop it except some divine manifestation. But there's no way we can. It's inevitable. And yet, what do people? What's all the activism? What's all the rallying cry? We're going to save the world. We're going to stop the war. We're going to do this and we're going to do that. Inevitable. America's done. If we were going to stop the inevitable crash of America, we'd have done it 100 years ago. If we were going to stop the inevitability of World War III, we would have done it 50 years ago. We've been doing it the whole time. So these things are inevitable. So in the modern day, I see that what's most obvious is the inevitable and the irrelevant. Because everything else is just details. Everything else is just a matter of who's eating and who's starving. Right? Who's driving around in a fancy car and who's hoofing it or taking the bus. Right? Who's making it and who's not. Those are the real details that affect us. All this other stuff that we argue about and that's in our papers, really, I would say, from what I see, it all falls into the category of inevitable or irrelevant. It either doesn't matter or it can't be helped. And we don't spend any energy on the stuff that does matter and can be helped, or we spend the minimal. They've reduced us in our brainwashed lives to spending the minimal amount on what does matter, like eating the best food instead of just eating whatever is available. You're never going to change the system, but you could change your own habits, right? Loving our neighbor instead of being afraid of our neighbor. That we can still do. So, anyway, that's, I want to talk about a couple of the articles this week, Dad. Just to catch up a little. Of course, the false flags continue. Horrible murders. This thing in France, the truck in Nice, the coup in Turkey. I don't even feel the wherewithal today, Dad, to try and dig up the details on any of these things, because it's also outlandish. It's also, if to do that just keeps dragging us into this cartoon of it all. The truth is, all of these things are staged around the world. Not that they're not real. I'm sure this coup attempt, I'm sure plenty of people died, and there's no doubt that the truck in Nice was running people over. But what's interesting is that with the truck in Nice, some guy from Tunisia, this Tunisian, apparently just an angry person. In this article, it says they talked to his father in Tunisia, who pointed out he doesn't pray, he's not religious, he's angry, he's a loner. You can't believe any of this stuff, you guys. I'm sorry, true or not, it's impossible. They've already, once you cry wolf 1,001 times, it's impossible to know if what you say is true. So you can't know. But what's interesting is how, even though there seemed to be zero connection to anything like a terrorist plot, France's mouthpiece president called it an act of terrorism. Hollande said the attack was undeniably terrorist in nature. Terrorist in nature. Well, in a general sense, it's murderous in nature, but it's not terrorist. Terrorism has a definition, which is to do these sort of things with a political motive, right? This 31-year-old unhappy man from Tunisia, can't call him a Muslim if he's not religious, can you? Might as well just call him a Frenchman. An unhappy Frenchman decided to go on a murderous rampage. Why does that make him a terrorist? Why does the journalism not point that out? So, it's so absurd that, it's hard for me to spend too much time inside these articles because it's the kind of thing that makes you want to shoot your television, And so I just want to keep painting the perspective that people can read the articles themselves and see the same cartoons that I see. The whole point is simply that terrorism is what is going on. And if it wasn't, you would specifically point out things like this as not being terrorist related. You would specifically point out that one unhappy man in a murderous rampage is not a terrorist act. And that no link to any terrorism has been shown. And that this has not been claimed by any terrorist group. And that there's... But what they want, of course, is division and hostility. And so everything nowadays is a terrorist act. Everything is a terrorist act. People have been shooting the police all of my life in my country. In fact, when you look at what went down and is still going down in all the inner cities with the minorities, especially the black populations in America, and you look at the oppression, the suppression, the absolute violence that's been perpetrated against these people for nothing but being black and poor, because that's not what the elites want in their world. They want those people eliminated, not educated, not integrated into society, not elevated into the middle and upper classes. They want these people eliminated from their society. And all that shows quite clearly in the way that they handle the inner cities with, brutal police that seem to be, the most brain dead people in our society. It's as if we find nothing but gangsters and brain dead losers and violent criminal elements and give them a gun and a badge and say, now go use all your natural skills and hurt these people over here. So that's been going on so long that it's undeniable. The history of it is, at least my whole generation old. And so there's been this conflict my whole life, and police have been shot, and never was it called terrorism, right? It was called race violence. And probably most of it remains race violence, even if the terrorists, meaning for the most part the government, the people behind it, the American government, the people behind the terror, same people who fund ISIS, I have no doubt, fund many of these acts of random violence. Many of them we know are set up, and they're certainly professionals brought in the place of some random violent maniac, like the shooting of JFK, for instance. Professional hit team blamed on a lone maniac. And yet they play that narrative for us over and over and over, and we just keep listening to it. And then we get mad and talk about we got to fight the terrorists. In fact, one of the things I really wanted to talk about out of the articles, Dad, was how they're calling for a war on terrorism. And I can't remember where this article is. I'm sorry. Well, let me go through the articles I have, because I haven't got much time, but we'll see what we can get out of these last few minutes, Dad. one of these articles says U.S.-Turkish tensions rise after failed coup attempt. Because, of course, what's so interesting over there is even President Obama comes out and says, something about supporting the democratic regime, where everybody seems to be able to point to Erdogan's regime as anything but democratic. Everything he's doing is almost like what Bush was doing during his years, solidifying all these sort of autocratic measures under a democratic guise. They seem to keep reporting to us that Erdogan has been, is like that on steroids, cracking down on the press, firing all the active, anybody that's had any voice that spoke at all against his government has either been fired, shut up, businesses closed down, all the kinds of things that you would think Americans could not abide in an ally that we send high-tech weapons to. Anyway, it's all part of this ridiculous modern cartoon leading us into ever-increasing conflict designed to eventually bring the world into conflict. So they're pointing out that after the failed coup attempt, the U.S.-Turkish tensions rise, as well as the tensions with Europe. So it just looks like this was designed to put Turkey either in a bad light or to reinforce Erdogan's position. Now everybody can get behind him, send him more weapons and assurances. Maybe that's what he needed to keep going with his part of the plan, to keep murdering the people that the Turks have been asked to murder. The Kurds, for instance, the Syrians, and this sort of thing. Maybe he was saying, I don't trust you guys. I want to be more solidified in my position before I go through with any more maneuvers for you. And so they said, okay, here's how we'll do it. We'll stage a coup. It'll fail. We'll talk about how everybody, that's not how to settle our differences. You can't just rise militarily against a leader, even though that's exactly what we're doing in Syria. So anyway, U.S.-Turkish tensions rise after failed coup attempt. So I'm not sure yet. We'll have to watch whether this means Turkey's on the outs or he's about to be sent even more weapons by NATO to make his position even more secure. We read some weeks ago about that whole THAAD missile system, the one that shoots down missiles out of the air. Well, now we're claiming, sorry, China and Russia, but the U.S. has to put its THAAD missile system in South Korea. And this is one of the most pretentious and absurd articles I've read in some time. It's a Business Insider UK from some woman named Amanda Macias. And it's absolutely, if you want to see white painted as black and black painted as white, this is the article. And so what we're, even though, of course, North Korea's had nothing but failed attempts since we threatened this, now we're doing it. All this whole article, I think people should read this. I don't know that I have the time to read this today, Dad, but it's really absurd, and it's got in here quoting two people, the general that was the general of NORAD, saying silly things like, if we are still defending with bows and arrows when the conflict escalates, we are not going to create the deterrent effect that we need to keep peace on the Korean Peninsula. So apparently that general imagines that our current defenses, which was, this article said, is some 28,000 troops in South Korea. We have 28,000 troops in South Korea, not to mention the weapons that we have over there. And this general has just classified that as defending with bows and arrows. Right? How's that sound? So I guess we've just been severely under-defended all of this time. What's that say for the geniuses? CIA Director Brennan said the deployment of THAAD to the region was an obligation. So, anyway, it's not good news if you're looking for a world that's not going to be blowing stuff up pretty soon, right? I don't think so. This one was pretty depressing too. Some mouthpiece in America named Kudlow did an article talking about Trump's 2 home runs. A promise of declaration of war on terrorism. So that shows you the absurdity. Again, does Donald Trump believe that terrorists attacked the Twin Towers? Airplanes flew into the Twin Towers? I want a president who isn't even intelligent enough to know that the physics of the established world denies such a categorically propaganda position, that A, planes didn't fly into buildings, and B, Muslim extremists didn't fund it. So that's what Donald Trump's home run. He wants to declare a war against terrorism. Okay, so look forward to that. And also, his other home run was by this mouthpiece right-wing moron that he's got now as his running mate, Pence. This conservative Christian. Watch out. Good conservative Christian. Well, he'll be ready to send millions of our children to die to protect Israel. Don't you fear for that. So, and let's see, what was his... because Pence is a church-going evangelical family man. He believes that the sanctity of human life is the central axiom of Western civilization. And because of that, wait till you see what he'll be voting for. Yeah. Pence called for sound monetary reform, tax relief, access to American energy, regulatory reform, and trade. What that means, you find out in here, is that what he wants is monetary reform means stop giving out handouts to the middle classes. They don't deserve welfare. They don't deserve food stamps. They don't deserve medical care. That's all crippling us. That's what we call nowadays, that's what we call monetary reform. Tax relief means, hey, come on, let the rich stop paying taxes. That way they might put a few bucks into the economy. So it means no money for the middle class, more money for the elite classes. Access to American energy, of course, means, unrestrained drilling and utilization of American resources, regardless of the destruction that it does to communities or environment. Regulatory reform, we find out in this article, means, deregulating. That's all we've been doing since Reagan, and every economist in the world shows you how it's destroyed our economy, and yet the home run that Trump hit is his second in command, his lieutenant, is calling for more deregulation and trade, of course, which means unfair trade. It means stealing the world's resources through the crippling of their economies through the unfair World Bank and International Monetary Fund. So that's what that says to me. So God help the world if Trump and Pence get the mouthpieces they put into office. But, of course, it's irrelevant because God help the world if Hillary Clinton and whichever criminal she decides to run with take office. Anyway, I'm going to cut it short, Dad. I'm going a little long. What I really wanted to get back to was the timing of all this. Wars and rumors of wars. Does that mean these wars might escalate until we reach a point where perhaps, I'm starting to see that with all the false flags, that what's going to happen perhaps is a nuclear bomb is going to explode. Something that they're going to do on purpose. That's what's going to bring all this to a head, or that's what's going to give the impetus to send all the troops, or whatever they're trying to get to right now, something's standing in the way of it. We know that they want to rebuild that temple in Jerusalem. And I don't know what's standing in the way of that. Who doesn't want that temple built? Or who has to be taken out of the way before that temple can be rebuilt? I think that's the central question that we need to ask ourselves. And then, will that temple be rebuilt before the Great War or after the Great War? And are the wars and rumors of wars that we're going through now, is this Sunni-Shia civil war the thing that's going to lead to the end of this segment and the building of the temple? I mean, if I had to guess, Dad, that's where I'm at right now. That what this is all doing, it's why all of these, incomprehensible moves in the Middle East designed to destabilize and create war and terror. Because ultimately, like the Sheik's pointing out the last couple of weeks, what he thinks NATO is trying to do is get Iran to have to jump, to have to go attack Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, to attack the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And that Sheikh Hussein says, if that happens, he believes there will be Shia-Sunni civil war. So in that light, it looks to me that this is the first order of business right now. Destabilize the Middle East, create Sunni-Shia civil war. Because what that does is releases this first seal, the white horse king that goes forth conquering and to conquer. Because remember, he's in the middle of a Sunni-Shia civil war now, if that's the way that goes down. And afterward, this good king now can make peace with Israel and do what they've planned all along. Rebuild that temple next to the Dome of the Mosque. 3.5 years later, that deal falls through because they attempt to set up their image in the temple. And that's what brings about now the build up to the final conflict. So that's the way I see it at the moment, Dad. And I see the news as, if you've been listening to me for the last year, I've been pointing out the escalation of false flags and wars and rumors of wars, and that, remember when they were talking about, this peace or this cessation of fighting that they were going to broker. Remember, and we said there's no reason. How can they possibly have any kind of, stopping of the fighting when there's no middle ground for either of them. And they're declaring that. It's all just a big joke. It's a big facade. It's a big play. And they have to keep all the players in character, which is why it can't just happen on one day. You've got all these people in the world that have to be moved, right? Somehow, those Turkish people, those poor buggers that were sold on the idea that let's get this criminal Erdogan out of here. Here, we'll fund you, we'll help you. Those people had to believe in what they were doing because they went in and died. And so, it's not being controlled as if every person is just given a script to read. The script is in a very small circle of people at the very top. And within that script is, I need Iran to attack the Saudi Arabian Peninsula so I can start a Sunni-Shia civil war. And before I do that, I need to make sure everybody's got lots of guns. And there's tremendous hostility in the region so that when that attack occurs, it will result in all-out civil war. And now within that narrative, strings have to be pulled. Money has to be pushed around the world. And people have to be convinced that there's something to go fight and die for. And that's what propaganda is all about. That's why the brainwashing of us all is so important. They couldn't accomplish this if Americans knew what I knew, because no Americans would go through with it. First of all, we'd have already gotten rid of these criminals in Washington when we saw what happened at 9/11. And after a few years of investigation and realizing that that didn't happen because of terrorism, that happened because the people behind the terrorists pulled that string. And the people, it's clear, the people in our world who are most implicated. It's been clear for all these years. Books have even been written about it now. There's no getting away from it. There's at least 100 people in our government who need to be questioned, right? Who need to be interrogated based on their involvement or knowledge of 9/11. But instead, the media keeps selling us about terrorists and airplanes and a war on terror. And now, Donald Trump calling for a war on global terrorism instead of calling for a revealing of the facts that there is no such thing as global terrorism. That the global terrorists are one and the same people who are funding his campaign. So anyway, Dad, that's the world I'm afraid we live in. And I say that, for me right now, I'm watching for this Sunni-Shia civil war. I'm watching for this escalation over there to result in that, or possibly for all of the escalations around the world to result in more warring for a time, until perhaps something even goes wrong and a dirty bomb goes off, or something that really makes the world stop and take a different tack. I think maybe that's what's coming, and that's when that first seal of Revelation opens and the world thinks that it's achieved something. Because I can't get around the idea that they're going to make this 7-year covenant that results in rebuilding the temple, and that after the 2 witnesses are killed, people are going to send gifts to each other. I mean, that's an odd scripture. Why would you say, we're not sending gifts to each other today. I mean, if ISIS was eliminated tomorrow, would people send gifts to each other? Maybe, right? Isn't that how bad the terrorism's getting? So in some way, I believe that has to be connected, that the wars and the terrorism have to get to such an extent that when that is finally stopped through, whether it's this Hashemite king gesture, rebuilding of the temple, however that comes about, that it creates such a relief in the world that 3.5 years of these two witnesses threaten that relief. And when those two terrorists are killed, as they will be called, the world has no other universal expression except to send gifts to one another. So anyway, which again would argue for the fact that we have not reached the end of the escalation of this part of the journey. The wars and rumors of wars must escalate until it looks like we are on the threshold of war with Russia, on the threshold of war with China. Perhaps the Sunnis and Shias are killing each other wholesale, and it looks like the world is on the verge of world war when suddenly it gets pulled back. But that only lasts for 3.5 years, and then the momentum picks up again. I don't know, but that's my guess at the moment. Thanks for having me on the show, Dad. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Well, Tony, I think you're exactly right. And it was another superb analysis of this week's happenings in the news in the Middle East. And folks, I hope you enjoyed the show today. And give us a little feedback. Go to BroSal.org on YouTube or the Philadelphian Church on YouTube. And comment, drop us a line, subscribe. And if you like what you're hearing and you want this to continue, drop us a frankincense offering. There's a button right up on the right-hand corner of the title to keep this ministry and the word coming to you. And for Tony, I'm Brother Sal. Till next week, we want you to have a great day in Christ. Thank you.